All right, boys and girls, we are back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can email us, as always, at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Happy to be joined today by Congressman Ken Buck of Colorado. Thanks so much, Congressman, for taking the time to sit down with us today.
It's my pleasure.
We have a new book of yours to talk about, Capital of Freedom. But before I get to that, I have to ask you a couple of questions coming out of this big tech hearing that attracted so much attention recently and that you participated in on the Judiciary Committee. Tell me a little bit about what you had wanted to get out of that hearing and what you did get.
So I think the most important thing we can get out of this, the tech hearing, was to educate the public. I think our oversight function was really the primary objective. I don't think many people understand, even though they sense that their privacy isn't being invaded, or folks on the right sense that there's bias, they don't understand the complete dominance that these 4 or 5 platforms have in America. And they can only get away with the privacy violations and the bias because of the dominance. And so it was really important for folks on the right and the left to understand, and not only do they dominate, but they cheat. And we talked about how they cheat, how they use their market position to crush competitors, small competitors, and just invite those competitors, take us to court. You know, we'll drown you in paper for 10 years and you will be out of business, and this whole thing will go away. And it's their strategy, and it can't continue.
One of the aspects of this that frustrates me is that a lot of the conversation tends to be about that first thing that you mentioned, a bias, people complaining about that. And people don't seem to understand that is completely subsidiary to the question of size and to in some cases, I think, potentially monopoly power that is used by a lot of these different entities. Some of the things that I think came out of that hearing indicating that type of thing were pretty disturbing in terms of the level of power that these big entities have used against potential competitors. What were some of the concerns that you had about what you heard?
Well, let me just reiterate something that you said, because I think you're absolutely right. You know, when we look for news, we can go to the Washington Post and we understand that it's biased on one side. We can go to Fox News. We can go to Wall Street Journal. But there are 100, if not thousands, of news sources that we can get information from. And as we receive that information, we're able to filter it, understanding the source. That's not true when you go to Google and you search for a particular item. You're going to find Don Jr. on page 23 of your Google search because they don't want him on page 1 or 2 or 3. And so the idea that there's no relationship between bias or no relationship between privacy and size just isn't true. If they didn't have a monopoly, they couldn't get away with doing what they're doing.
I know that a lot of people are mindful of what's going on in the context of this current election when it relates to tech. There have been some big stories about Google potentially mucking about with the traffic or the algorithms being used to hide various content from right of center places. And we experienced our own threat of demonetization at the behest of a leftist from the UK, something that didn't ultimately happen, but does represent how much power Google has over directing traffic and over the ad market in which they are the biggest player. And that to me is an item of concern, particularly if they go down this road of banning third-party cookies, essentially saying, if you want to advertise, you can only go through us.
Absolutely. And they get special protections from Congress through legislation that, so if someone puts something on Google, for example, or on Facebook or on Twitter that is false medical information, for example, they have protection that they can post that without and take reasonable precautions without being sued for libel or some other. They are, in other words, they are a bulletin board. Mm-hmm. And now all of a sudden they've taken that special protection as a bulletin board and they've gone in and they have, in a biased way, taken out certain speech. And I really think it's one of the things, and I've talked to Chairman Cicilline about this, one of the things that Congress needs to look at in terms of these platforms is how do we address bias? And maybe we address bias by having 5 Googles. and you can go to one of the Googles and you can search and you can get something that is conservative friendly, and somebody else can go to a Google and get something that's liberal friendly, just like we do when we look at cable news at night.
I'm concerned about the privacy aspect of this, particularly as it relates to children. We have all read, I think, by this point, about the ways that these different companies track and monetize kids from a very young age, including some disturbing things about the corners of kids' YouTube that have had different problems. Within the past year, I think people have become much more aware of this, and I hear a lot about it from parents. Is there an aspect of this privacy that needs to be focused on protecting the way that these companies seek to monetize children from a very young age and stick with them basically throughout their lifetime, something that's going to follow them in terms of the data of what they look at, the information about their purchases and their habits, that is really quite invasive when you think about it?
Well, Ben, you and I are children at heart, so I really think it should apply to all of us. I agree with what you're saying about children, and they are particularly vulnerable. But I just got a text from my daughter-in-law who was on Facebook communicating about looking for a pair of shoes. She goes on Google, and next thing you know, there's 100 ads for shoes. It's not even that she Googled something concerning shoes. It's that they all these platforms are now, selling to each other and monetizing what they do for other platforms. And I believe the best thing that we can do, first of all, we have to have parental controls for the internet and allow parents to determine what kids can see up to a certain age. And I think one of the keys, though, from my perspective, is that every time you go on and search for something or post something on one of the platforms, you have to click a yes box that says, I give up my privacy. You can use this information for any purpose. It can't be on page 32 of a user agreement that nobody ever reads. That isn't good enough in terms of how we should be protecting individuals' privacy. Political privacy, whether it's a consumer issue, whatever it is, your privacy is something we should protect.
Well, let's connect that to this broader conversation about cancel culture and some of the information that we have on that front. The work that Emily Ekins has done at the Cato Institute and through YouGov polling just in the past couple of weeks has laid out a scene that seems very disturbing, where many, many Americans, significant percentages, majorities of virtually every aspect of the ideological spectrum, with the exception of the furthest left progressives, express their own nervousness about publicly making known their political views. And to a significant degree, in terms of percentages of people who were polled, they found support for firing people based on their political donations. That if they were if they were donating money to the Trump campaign, if they're donating money to the Democratic candidate, that they would be justified in being fired. To me, that's a depiction of a culture where this level of this debate about privacy is going to be a lot more important, because if you have kind of a weaponized culture, which is a fundamental problem, in that where it's going to be, it's going to be a situation where your views could result in significant life changes. I think we have to be even more mindful of this, don't we?
Absolutely. And I think that it's a great point. And I think a lot of Americans, when I see these polls that, so-and-so is behind by 18 points, it's absolute nonsense. A lot of Americans don't want to answer those questions, or they don't want to, have someone in their mind. It's not that they change their minds 3 days before they vote. And so I think that the same is true with, I may look something up because I'm interested about how the socialists are thinking. It doesn't mean that I approve of this, and yet I'm treated on the internet as if I get MoveOn.org texts every day. It's hilarious. If there's one person they're wasting their money on, it's Ken Buck. But I love it, and I don't tell them about it because I want them to keep doing it, so that they're distracted from any good that they could do for themselves. So yes, I think that absolutely we need to make sure that that privacy, that kind of privacy, is enhanced.
One other aspect of this before we start talking about your book, there is a real movement, it seems to me, to for the left to really advance on what they believe to be the wind at their back, that the culture war is going their way, and that they're going to be able to get a lot out of this moment. There's been a theory advanced by some commentators in media that, oh, this is just because Donald Trump is president and he's deeply unpopular with the left, and they're very, animated by defeating him, and that if he's defeated, this culture war will dissipate, things will return to normal in some capacity. And it's hard for me to believe that. I really don't. I feel like this is a cultural moment that is much bigger than who is actually president or not. What's your perspective on that as someone who's coming from and further enough outside of the Acela corridor?
Well, I have to tell you, when I'm in D.C., all I hear is the nonsense about, the negativity surrounding this administration and conservatives. When I get out into the real world, I have people that are so frustrated that they can't get back to work, so frustrated they can't open their business, so frustrated that they're watching TV and somebody is pulling down a statue or burning down a Kentucky Fried Chicken or Wendy's or whatever it is, and the police aren't doing anything about it, and they're just furious that America has devolved into this lawless society. We've been talking about the rule of law as it pertains to immigration and other issues for years, and the left's response to us every single time is defund ICE, defund the police, and what they're really saying is, we don't want the rule of law. We understand that a legislature met, and in this case Congress, passed immigration laws, but the way to change that is not to pass new immigration laws and take responsibility for those changes. The way to change that is, let's just defund the law enforcement agency that's responsible for that. So I think there's a lot of frustration, and I think you're going to see that in November. I'm barely old enough, but I do remember the 1968 riots at the Democratic National Convention. Those resulted in a landslide victory. Americans and Americans in this sense are not different in 2020 than 1968. Americans don't like chaos. They want security. They want a consistency in their lives. And I believe that we're going to see the results in November of a backlash.
Well, one of the aspects of chaos that I think that they've disliked in recent months has definitely been what Washington and the administration, but also administrations across the country, have done when it comes to their decisions being made about reopening, about how to handle the challenge of the coronavirus. Tell me where you think things stand right now. Do you feel on more solid footing? And everything in Washington, media-wise, has been focused on this stimulus question and more unemployment dollars. But to me, I'm not sure that that's going to make a huge difference. What do you think about it?
Well, I think there's a few things that we need to look at. One is the Democrats, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, are doing their very best to try to undermine the perception that this president can govern. And so the longer that this draws out, the more they hope it looks like President Trump doesn't have credibility. I think, again, there may very well be a backlash. People know that the Trump administration has come to the table, asked for a clean reauthorization on unemployment insurance and other issues. A clean reauthorization, frankly, I don't support, because I'm not in favor of paying people $600 more to stay out of work than to go back to work. So there are some problems with it, but at least it gets us past the election. It gets us past the point of that political debate when we can start talking rationally to each other again. So I think one thing is that we need to make sure that the economy stays liquid, and there has to be money flowing in order for that to happen. So I understand where the administration is coming from on that particular issue. I also see the governors and not the president. And some people misunderstand the levels of government and how they are interacting with this COVID response. But the governors are responsible for shutting down the economies in 50 states and reopening those economies and putting restrictions on people. And I think it's unfair to say, President Trump is responsible for this death or this restriction. The reality is President Trump's trying to do what he can with the economy. The governors are responsible for the safety of the people that live in their states.
What experience have you had talking to people in Colorado about how they feel that their governor and his administration has handled it?
So I think there's really mixed reactions. You know, I in my congressional district, I have counties that haven't had a single case of COVID, and yet they have a mandatory mask order in place. And you know, when you're on a tractor and you're out plowing a field, you don't really care what the governor says about a mandatory mask. And so we have a disrespect for the law that is growing in Colorado because of the really irrational restrictions that have been placed on Americans. Having said that, our governor is one of the more liberal governors in America, and he is opening up much more quickly than Michigan, than DC, than other places. And so I think that there is a recognition that he is trying to balance interests, even if he's trying to appease a very liberal base with some of these restrictions.
The contest between your Senator Cory Gardner and John Hickenlooper is obviously one that has attracted a lot of national attention. What do you think about the way that race is going, given that, you know, Cory has to navigate as a senator within a state that is certainly purple at minimum?
Well, you and I have talked about bias a little bit as it relates to the platforms. I am not only a good friend of Cory's and a congressman, a Republican congressman who serves in the House and really admires Cory's service in the Senate, but I'm also the state Republican Party chair in Colorado. So I have a little bias going into this, but I will tell you right now, Cory Gardner is going to win. Cory Gardner is one of the best candidates in this country. He is just a bright ray of sunshine, and he is so well prepared. He's been around the state. He has $11 million cash on hand. John Hickenlooper has $4.5 million cash on hand. Cory was the chair of the NRSC last cycle. The NRSC is going to come in a big way and help Cory, I'm sure. So there's all these positive factors, and the fact that Cory has done a great job as a senator. He's passed 12 major pieces of legislation that have helped Colorado, and he can point to those in his campaign.
I'm going to ask you to explain something without prepping you for it, which is this whole thing that shook out with scandals related to the Hickenlooper administration and to a couple of the things that he did. It didn't get a lot of play here in Washington because obviously they've been focused on the global pandemic and everything else related to that. But it seemed like it's kind of a significant thing, and one that's been quite contentious. Can you give us the thumbnail of what's gone on there?
Sure. So John Hickenlooper got certain plane rides from private individuals to go to events around the country when he was governor. What he needed to do is he needed to fill out a form disclosing that he accepted those gifts. Many of those plane rides, he was on the plane with state legislators who did fill out those forms. Nothing wrong with taking the plane ride. You just have to disclose it as a gift. And he didn't disclose it. So he was then, there were ethics charges filed against him with the Colorado Ethics Commission. The commission held a hearing. He refused to show up to the hearing. So he was held in contempt for not showing up to the hearing. Then he shows up to the hearing because he's being held in contempt, and they find him guilty of the charges. So he was fined, the largest fine in Colorado history from the Ethics Commission. And what's interesting was the Ethics Commission declined to hear 60, 70 different ethics complaints against John Hickenlooper because they were outside the statute of limitations. Those aren't outside the statute of limitations for political commercials in the fall. They're just outside the statute of limitations for the Ethics Commission. So there's a lot of material that goes to this candidate's ability to serve honorably in the United States Senate.
You have a reputation as being a fiscal conservative, cares about that side of things. Fiscal conservatism not having a very good moment in terms of successes, it doesn't seem like. Obviously this is a unique time, and there's lots of people, even people who've come to me and said, this is one of those moments when you can't just be looking at the future costs of decisions that you have to make on an emergency basis. But with every passing week, it feels like we have the announcement of more big plans, more huge expenditures, whether they're coming from the Congress or whether they're coming from Joe Biden. There's a lot of promises about continuing to spend the country into what is, from my perspective and those of others, a pretty dangerous space. How can we be confident that we're not just sticking our kids and grandkids with a gigantic bill?
Well, first of all, I have also heard sort of messaging on the other side that the Democrats would love to defund the police. They would love to abolish ICE. They're willing to cut things as long as it doesn't stop their protests and arsons and violence. But you're absolutely right. The big spending proposals from the Biden campaign, the big spending that's going on in Congress right now is scary. And there is one thing that we can tell our grandchildren with confidence, and that's you got to pay back $30 trillion. And by the way, no one's ever seen $30 trillion. You could stack $1 bills on top of each other and go to the moon and back a few hundred times with $30 trillion. So we have no plan in this country and no plan from either party to repay that kind of debt. And it's the reason I speak out about it. And it's the reason I'm frustrated. There's a HBO premiere film tonight, and I'm one of the three principals in the film, and the Denver Post picked up on it and said, "Oh, Ken Buck's leaving Congress." Well, it may sound that way because I'm so frustrated because
I was going to ask you about that next, in fact. So what is your response to their report?
Oh, it's nonsense, but it's all, first of all, the Denver Post is this liberal rag that is just always trying to find some way of needling me and undermining me. But the truth is I'm very frustrated, and other fiscal conservatives are very frustrated that we can't break through. And when you pass a $3 trillion bill, okay, that's bad. Talk about how you're going to repay it. You don't have to have the payment today, but you have to have some sort of plan over the long haul to repay $3 trillion. We're rapidly approaching 30 trillion, and we aren't even discussing in this presidential election how to repay that money.
I am wondering what you believe the Trump agenda looks like for the next 4 years, because I don't feel like I'm hearing it from the president himself. He engages in these fights. He obviously has a ton of things to deal with when it comes to the virus, but I hear the proposals from Joe Biden, and they strike me as very radical. They strike me as very much outside the realm of the moderate reputation that he had in Congress. But I don't feel like I really hear the agenda from Trump other than, just trust us, we're going to make things better if you reelect us.
Yeah, so I think that the president has clearly demonstrated his ability to improve the economy. The first 2.5 3 years of the Trump administration were a stark contrast to the Obama administration and the failures of managing the economy. And I think the strongest point that the president has in his favor is, who do you trust to bring our economy back? The person who was part of the Obama administration, where we had a sluggish economy for 8 years, and certainly the first year or two of that sluggish economy, you could understand why. But after that, they owned it, and they couldn't do anything about it because they didn't believe in deregulating. They didn't believe in reducing taxes. This president has a plan to bring us back from this pandemic and the economic crisis that it's caused. This president also is a strong believer that the United States military can be a force for good around the world. Now, from my view, a reduced military could also be a strong force for good, and we have to make sure that we understand what to get into and what not to get into. This president has demonstrated, as it relates to the Kurds and other conflicts around the globe, that he is willing to pull back. So I think a strong foreign policy that is rational at the same time as a vigorous economy are the two issues that this president will run on and has a record of accomplishment.
Let's talk about your book, Capital of Freedom. You basically go throughout the book and talk about different aspects of the American experience, of what has made the country great, and you tie it to the statues that make up the inside of the Capitol, the symbols that are all over the place in that building. Did you anticipate that you'd be releasing this during a period of such iconoclasm in America?
I didn't. The Antifa has made my book a lot more relevant than it was before. I turned it in on Thanksgiving Day, and so. But what I do is I've studied the Capitol, and I've gone with historians and architect of the Capitol, the House historian David Barton from Texas, many others, and really learned a lot about the Capitol. And there are so many wonderful symbols of freedom in the Capitol, and I talk about those symbols and the particular constitutional principle that it relates to. So freedom of religion, or the Second Amendment, or separation of powers. And each chapter talks about the history of a feature in the Capitol, the constitutional principle, and where the progressives are so wrong in trying to take this country, in denying our history and rewriting our history. It's embarrassing that they are absolutely wrong. And I think this book really points out why they're wrong.
What's your favorite statue or symbol in the Capitol that people might not instantly be familiar with as a historical figure or otherwise?
So there's so many stories behind the story, but one of my favorites is something that most people see in the rotunda. It's George Washington resigning his commission, and it's so, when you put it in the context of history, in Europe, successful generals would grab more and more power. And here's a man who gave up power to benefit the Republic. But one of my favorite stories is on the top of the dome of the Capitol is the Statue of Freedom, and it's recognizable by everybody. And that Statue of Freedom was put there by a slave. And very few people have heard the story of Philip Reed, how he was purchased in South Carolina, worked at a foundry in Washington, D.C., and then worked to put that statue on the Capitol dome. And I just think it's a great story about how far we have come as a country. We still have a long ways to go, but we should be celebrating the fact that we are a great country because we believe in freedom.
Did you notice or take notice of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's criticism of the Father Damien statue recently?
Oh, I don't take notice of much of what she says.
Well, it was interesting because she was criticizing it as being a symbol of colonizers, and that it should have been replaced with a couple of other different folks from Hawaii. Of course, Father Damien is a Belgian a priest who traveled to work with lepers in Hawaii for an extended amount of time, and then eventually contracted the disease himself and died. He's viewed as someone who is still held in high esteem by Native Hawaiians and by representatives from Hawaii. To me, that's a perfect example of looking at a statue and not knowing the history.
Absolutely, and frankly, AOC has as much influence over what people in Hawaii think as she does over what people in Colorado think. And so I wish her the very best in Brooklyn, New York.
With the time that we have left, I understand that as someone who has seen the conservative movement kind of go through different periods in terms of the rise of populism in recent years, a number of shifts in terms of its priority. How healthy do you think that movement is? It's frequently depicted in the media as being one that has been subsumed into the person of Donald Trump, that basically survives dependent on his own political future and everything like that. But you've been around long enough to see that it's where it's come before and where it's headed now. How do you feel about the health of the movement?
I think you trace it back to Barry Goldwater or maybe even earlier than that, and you've seen leaders come and go, but these conservative ideals are in place. And the reason they're in place, we lose to the left often on messaging, or we lose based on the left having greater resources. We lose on a lot of things to the left, but we don't lose on ideas, and those ideas transcend any particular person, and they will be around after Donald Trump leaves office, and there will be other leaders ready to pick up those ideas and really make sure that Americans understand that their prosperity, their freedom is based on conservative ideals. One of the things I mentioned in the book Capital of Freedom is that the left are not progressives, they are regressives. The idea that we can gain more freedom by the government taking over the healthcare system is crazy. The idea that if we just paid more taxes, gave more of our money to the government, life would be better in some way. It's not. I'm the best person, and you're the best person to be able to spend your money in the marketplace, and really businesses thrive because we spend our money, not because they get assistance from the government. So the idea that these progressive regressives are going to beat us in ideas is just crazy. It's not going to happen.
Congressman Ken Buck, your new book is Capital of Freedom. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.